Thomas Woodrow Wilson, December 28, 1856 – February 3, 1924, was an American statesman and academic who served as the 28th President of the United States from 1913 to 1921. A member of the Democratic Party, Wilson served as the president of Princeton University from 1902 to 1910 and then ran and was elected as a progressive Democrat to the office of Governor of New Jersey. Wilson's victory in the 1912 presidential election made him the first Southerner elected to the presidency since Zachary Taylor in 1848. He also led the United States during World War I, establishing an activist foreign policy known as Wilsonianism. He was a major leader at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, where he championed the proposed League of Nations. However, he was unable to obtain Senate approval for U.S. membership. After he suffered debilitating strokes in September 1919, his wife and staff members handled most of his presidential duties. Born in Stanton, Virginia, he spent his early years in Augusta, Georgia, and Columbia, South Carolina. His father was a leading Presbyterian in the Confederacy during the Civil War, and Wilson was always a devout Presbyterian and a proud Southerner. He took a law degree and then one of the first PhDs in political science awarded by Johns Hopkins University. He served as a professor and scholar at various institutions before being selected as president of Princeton University, a position he held from 1902 to 1910. Wilson became a notable academic, arguing for the superiority of the parliamentary system. He was associated with Grover Cleveland and the conservative Bourbon Democrats until 1910, when he moved left. With the help of state Democratic bosses, Wilson won the 1910 Democratic nomination for governor of New Jersey, and was elected as a fresh reformer, holding office from 1911 to 1913. He overthrew the same bosses and gained a national reputation. He won the 1912 Democratic presidential nomination after 46 rounds of balloting, with support from William Jennings Bryan. Former President Theodore Roosevelt's third-party candidacy split the Republican Party, which renominated incumbent President William Howard Taft. Wilson won the 1912 election with a plurality of the popular vote and a large majority in the Electoral College. Leading the Congress that was now in Democratic hands, he oversaw the passage of progressive legislative policies unparalleled until the New Deal in 1933. The Federal Reserve Act, Federal Trade Commission Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, and the Federal Farm Loan Act were some of these new policies. Having taken office 1 month after ratification of the 16th Amendment, Wilson called a special session of Congress, whose work culminated in the Revenue Act of 1913, introducing an income tax and lowering tariffs. Through passage of the Adamson Act that imposed an 8-hour workday for railroads, he averted a railroad strike and an ensuing economic crisis. Upon the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Wilson maintained a policy of neutrality, while pursuing a more aggressive policy in dealing with Mexico's Civil War. Wilson staffed his government with Southern Democrats who implemented racial segregation at the Treasury, Navy, and other federal offices. In the presidential election of 1916, Wilson faced former New York Governor Charles Evans Hughes. By a narrow margin, he became the first Democrat since Andrew Jackson elected to 2 consecutive terms. In April 1917, when Germany had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and sent the Zimmermann telegram, Wilson asked Congress to declare war in order to make the world safe for democracy. The United States conducted military operations alongside the Allies, although without a formal alliance. During the war, Wilson focused on diplomacy and financial considerations, leaving military strategy to the generals, especially General John J. Pershing. Through the Selective Service Act, conscription sent 10,000 freshly trained soldiers to France per day by the summer of 1918. On the home front, he raised income taxes, borrowing billions of dollars through the public's purchase of Liberty bonds. He set up the War Industries Board, promoted labor union cooperation, regulated agriculture and food production through the Lever Act, and took direct control of the nation's railroad system. Wilson asked Congress for what became the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, suppressing anti-draft activists. The crackdown was intensified by his Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer to include expulsion of non-citizen radicals during the first Red Scare of 1919–1920. Early in 1918, Wilson issued his Principles for an End to the War, the 14 Points, and in 1919, following an armistice, he traveled to Paris, promoting the formation of a League of Nations and concluding the Treaty of Versailles. Following his return from Europe, Wilson embarked on a nationwide tour in 1919 to campaign for the treaty, but suffered a severe stroke. The treaty was met with serious concern by Senate Republicans, and the Senate ultimately rejected the treaty. Due to his stroke, Wilson secluded himself in the White House, disability having diminished his power and influence, and he failed in his bid to win renomination at the 1920 Democratic National Convention. Wilson retired at the end of his presidency, and he died in 1924. He is ranked by scholars and historians as one of the best U.S. presidents. Early life. Wilson was born to a Scots-Irish-American family in Stanton, Virginia, on December 28, 1856, at 1824 North Coulter Street, now the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library. He was the third of 4 children of Joseph Ruggles Wilson and Jessie Janet Woodrow. Wilson's paternal grandparents immigrated to the United States from Strabane, County Tyrone, Ireland, present-day Northern Ireland, in 1807. His mother was born in Carlisle, England, the daughter of Reverend Dr. Thomas Woodrow from Paisley, Scotland, and Marion Williamson from Glasgow. Joseph Wilson's immigrant family settled in Steubenville, Ohio. There his father published a pro-tariff and anti-slavery newspaper, the Western Herald and Gazette. After marrying, Joseph and Jessie Wilson moved to the southern United States in 1851 and came to fully identify with it, moving from Virginia deeper into the region as Wilson became a minister in Georgia and South Carolina. Joseph Wilson owned slaves, defended slavery, and also set up a Sunday school for his slaves. Both parents identified with the Confederacy during the American Civil War. They cared for wounded soldiers at their church, and Wilson's father briefly served as a chaplain to the Confederate Army. Woodrow Wilson's earliest memory, from the age of 3, was of hearing that Abraham Lincoln had been elected and that a war was coming. Wilson would forever recall standing for a moment at General Robert E. Lee's side and looking up into his face. In 1861, Wilson's father was one of the founders of the Southern Presbyterian Church in the United States, PCUS, after it split from the Northern Presbyterians. He served as the first permanent clerk of the Southern Church's General Assembly, was stated clerk for more than 3 decades from 1865 to 1898, and was moderator of the PCUS General Assembly in 1879. He became minister of the First Presbyterian Church in Augusta, Georgia, and the family lived there until 1870, when young Wilson was 14. Wilson in 1873 became a communicant member of the Columbia First Presbyterian Church in South Carolina and remained a member throughout his life. Education. Wilson began reading at age 10. The delayed start was possibly caused by dyslexia. He later blamed the lack of schools in the postbellum South. As a teen, he taught himself the Graham shorthand system to compensate, and achieved academically with self-discipline, studying at home with his father, then in classes at a small Augusta, Georgia school. During Reconstruction, Wilson lived in Columbia, South Carolina, from 1870 to 1874, while his father was professor at the Columbia Theological Seminary. His father moved the family to Wilmington, North Carolina, in 1874, where he was the minister at First Presbyterian Church until 1882. Wilson attended Davidson College in North Carolina for the 1873-74 school year, cut short by illness, then transferred to Princeton as a freshman. He graduated in 1879, a member of Phi Kappa Psi fraternity. In his second year, he studied political philosophy and history, was active in the Whig Literary and Debating Society, and wrote for the Nassau Literary Review. He organized the Liberal Debating Society and later coached the Whig Clio debate panel. In the hotly contested presidential election of 1876, Wilson declared his support for the Democratic Party and its nominee, Samuel J. Tilden. In 1879, Wilson attended the University of Virginia School of Law for 1 year. He was involved in the Virginia Glee Club and was president of the Jefferson Literary and Debating Society. While there, he enjoyed frequent trips to his birthplace of Stanton. He visited with cousins, and fell in love with one, Hattie Woodrow, though his affections were unrequited. When his health became frail and dictated his withdrawal from studies, he went home to his parents, then living in Wilmington, North Carolina, where he continued his law studies. Wilson was admitted to the Georgia bar and made a brief attempt at law practice in January 1882. He found legal history and substantive jurisprudence interesting, but abhorred the day-to-day procedural aspects. After less than a year, he abandoned the practice to pursue his study of political science and history. Both parents expressed concern over a potentially premature decision. In the fall of 1883, Wilson entered Johns Hopkins University to study history, political science, and the German language. 3 years later, he completed his doctoral dissertation, Congressional Government, a Study in American Politics, and received a Ph.D. Marriage and Family. In late spring of 1883, Wilson was summoned to Rome, Georgia, to assist in the settlement of his maternal uncle William's estate, which was being mishandled by a brother-in-law. While there he met and fell in love with Ellen Louise Axon, the daughter of a minister from Savannah, Georgia. He proposed to her and they became engaged in Asheville. Wilson's marriage to Ellen was delayed by traumatic developments in her family. In late 1883, Ellen's father Edward, suffering from depression, was admitted to the Georgia State Mental Hospital, where in 1884 he committed suicide. After closing the family home in Rome, Georgia, and recovering from the initial shock, Ellen gained admission to the Art Students League of New York. After graduation, she pursued portrait art and received a medal for one of her works from the Paris International Exposition. She happily agreed to sacrifice further independent artistic pursuits in order to keep her marriage commitment, and in 1885 she and Wilson married. Personal interests. Wilson was an automobile enthusiast and, while president, he took daily rides in his favorite car, a 1919 Pierce Arrow. His enjoyment of motoring made him an advocate of funding for public highways. He was also an avid baseball fan, and in 1915 became the first sitting president to attend and throw out the first ball at a World Series game. Wilson had been a center fielder during his Davidson College days and was the Princeton team's assistant manager. Also, he cycled regularly, taking several cycling vacations in the English Lake District. Wilson later took up golf. Academic career. Wilson worked as a lecturer at Cornell University in 1886-87, where he joined the Irving Literary Society. He next taught at Bryn Mawr College from 1885 until 1888, teaching ancient Greek and Roman history, While there, he refused offers from the universities of Michigan and Indiana. When Ellen was pregnant with their first child in 1886, the couple decided that Ellen should go to her Aunt Louisa Brown's residence in Gainesville, Georgia, to have their first child. She arrived just one day before the baby, Margaret, was born in April 1886. Their second child, Jessie, was born in August 1887. In 1888, Wilson left Bryn Mawr for Wesleyan University. It was a controversial move, as he had signed a 3-year contract with Bryn Mawr in 1887. Both parties claimed contract violations and the matter subsided. At Wesleyan, was inducted into Phi Beta Kappa and coached the football team and founded the debate team, which bears his name. In February 1890, with the help of friends, Wilson was elected by the Princeton University Board to the chair of Jurisprudence and Political Economy, at an annual salary of $3,000. He continued a previous practice of reserving time for a 6-week course in administration at Johns Hopkins. He was also a faculty member of the short-lived Coordinate College, Evelyn College for Women. Additionally, Wilson became the first lecturer of constitutional law at New York Law School, where he taught with Charles Evans Hughes. Representing the American Whig Society, Wilson delivered an oration at Princeton's sesquicentennial celebration, 1896, entitled Princeton in the Nation's Service, which was the origin for the school's motto. Wilson became annoyed that Princeton was not living up to its potential, complaining, "There's a little college down in Kentucky which in 60 years has graduated more men who have acquired prominence and fame than has Princeton in her 150 years. Political science author. U.S. and British system contrast. Wilson, a disciple of Walter Bagehot, considered the United States Constitution to be cumbersome and open to corruption. Wilson favored a parliamentary system for the United States and in the early 1880s wrote, "I ask you to put this question to yourselves, should we not draw the executive and legislature closer together? Should we not, on the one hand, give the individual leaders of opinion in Congress a better chance to have an intimate party in determining who should be president, and the president, on the other hand, a better chance to approve himself a statesman, and his advisers capable men of affairs, in the guidance of Congress?" Wilson's first political work, Congressional Government, 1885, advocated a parliamentary system. He critically described the United States government, with frequent negative comparisons to Westminster. Critics contended the book was written without the benefit of the author observing any operational aspect of the U.S. Congress, and supporters asserted the work was the product of the imagination of a future statesman. The book reflected the greater power of the legislature, relative to the executive, during the postbellum period. Wilson later became a regular contributor to Political Science Quarterly, an academic journal. Wilson's second publication in 1890 was a textbook, entitled The State, used widely in college courses throughout the country until the 1920s. He argued that government should not be deemed evil and advocated the use of government to allay social ills and advance society's welfare. In 1889 Wilson contributed to a U.S. historical series, covering the period from President Andrew Jackson through Reconstruction. His third book, entitled Division and Reunion, was published in 1893 and considered an outstanding contribution to American historical writing. Wilson's fourth publication, a 5-volume work entitled History of the American People, was the culmination of a series of articles written for Harper's, and was published in 1902. In 1899, Wilson wrote in the state that governments could legitimately promote the general welfare by forbidding child labor, by supervising the sanitary conditions of factories, by limiting the employment of women in occupations hurtful to their health, by instituting official tests of the purity or the quality of goods sold, by limiting the hours of labor in certain trades, by 101 limitations of the power of unscrupulous or heartless men to outdo the scrupulous and merciful. In trade or industry, Wilson believed that America's system of checks and balances complicated American governance. If government behaved badly, Wilson queried, how is the schoolmaster, the nation, to know which boy needs the whipping? Wilson singled out the United States House of Representatives for particular criticism, saying, "Divide it up, as it were, into 47 signories, in each of which a standing committee is the court baron and its chairman Lord Proprietor. These petty barons, some of them not a little powerful, but none of them within reach the full powers of rule, may at will exercise an almost despotic sway within their own shires, and may sometimes threaten to convulse even the realm itself." In his last scholarly work, Constitutional Government of the United States, 1908, Wilson said that the presidency will be as big as and as influential as the man who occupies it. By the time of his presidency, Wilson hoped that presidents could be party leaders in the same way British prime ministers were. Wilson also hoped that the parties could be reorganized along ideological, not geographic, lines. He wrote, 8 words contain the sum of the present degradation of our political parties: no leaders, no principles, no principles, no parties. Wilson also wrote that charity efforts should be removed from the private domain and made the imperative legal duty of the whole, a position which, according to Robert M. Saunders, seemed to indicate that Wilson was laying the groundwork for the modern welfare state. On the road to becoming governor of New Jersey, Wilson professed his hearty support for reasonable working hours, accident insurance, and just wages. While serving as governor of New Jersey, Wilson vocally supported measures for the benefit of labor such as employers' liability, tenement house legislation, and factory laws. Public administration. Wilson also studied public administration, which he called government in action. It is the executive, the operative, the most visible side of government, and is of course as old as government itself. He believed that the study of public administration could enable officials to increase governmental efficiency. He faulted political leaders who focused on philosophical issues and the nature of government and dismissed the critical issues of government administration as mere practical detail. He thought such attitudes represented the requirements of smaller countries and populations. By his day, he thought, it is getting to be harder to run a constitution than to frame one. He thought it time to straighten the paths of government, to make its business less unbusinesslike, to strengthen and purify its organization, and it to crown its dutifulness. He summarized the growth of such foreign states as Prussia, France, and England, highlighting the events that led to advances in administration. By contrast, he thought the United States required greater compromise because of the diversity of public opinion and the difficulty of forming a majority opinion, thus practical reform of the government was necessarily slow. Yet Wilson insisted that administration lies outside the proper sphere of politics and that general laws which direct these things to be done are as obviously outside of and above administration. He likened administration to a machine that functions independent of the changing mood of its leaders. Such a line of demarcation is intended to focus responsibility for actions taken on the people or persons in charge. As Wilson put it, public attention must be easily directed, in each case of good or bad administration, to just the man deserving of praise or blame. There is no danger in power, if only it be not irresponsible. If it be divided, dealt out in share to many, it is obscured. Essentially, he contended that the items under the discretion of administration must be limited in scope, as to not block, nullify, obfuscate, or modify the implementation of governmental decree made by the executive branch. President of Princeton University. Wilson had in the past been offered the presidency at the University of Illinois in 1892, and at the University of Virginia in 1901, both of which he declined. The Princeton trustees promoted Professor Wilson to president in June 1902, replacing Francis Landy Patton, whom the trustees perceived to be an inefficient administrator. Although the school's endowment was barely $4 million, Wilson sought $2 million for a preceptorial system of teaching, $1 million for a school of science, and nearly $3 million for new buildings and salary increases. As a long-term objective, Wilson sought $3 million for a graduate school and $2.5 million for schools of jurisprudence and electrical engineering, as well as a museum of natural history. He increased the faculty from 112 to 174, most of whom he selected himself on the basis of their records as outstanding teachers. The curriculum guidelines he developed proved important progressive innovations in the field of higher education. Wilson also made biblical studies a scholarly pursuit, appointed the first Jew and the first Roman Catholic to the faculty, and helped liberate the board from domination by conservative Presbyterians. To emphasize the development of expertise, Wilson instituted academic departments and a system of core requirements. Students were to meet for these in groups of 6 with preceptors, followed by 2 years of concentration in a selected major. He tried to raise admission standards and to replace the gentleman's C with serious study. Wilson aspired, as he told alumni, to transform thoughtless boys performing tasks into thinking men. In 1906 Wilson awoke to find himself blind in the left eye, the result of a blood clot and hypertension. Modern medical opinion surmises Wilson had suffered a stroke. He later was diagnosed, as his father had been, with hardening of the arteries. He took a Bermuda vacation. He began to exhibit his father's traits of impatience and intolerance, which would on occasion lead to errors of judgment. In 1896 Wilson had, somewhat prophetically, described his problem, in the sesquicentennial speech at Princeton: "Your thorough Presbyterian is not subject to the ordinary laws of life, is of too stubborn a fiber, too unrelaxing a purpose, to suffer mere inconvenience to bring defeat." When Wilson began vacationing in Bermuda in 1906, he met a socialite, Mary Hulbert Peck. Their visits together became a regular occurrence on his return. Wilson in his letters home to Ellen openly related these gatherings as well as other social events. According to biographer August Heckscher, Ellen could sense a problem, and it became the topic of frank discussion between them. Wilson historians have not conclusively established there was an affair, but Wilson did on one occasion write amusing in shorthand on the reverse side of a draft for an editorial, "My precious one, my beloved Mary." Wilson also sent very personal letters which would be used against him by his adversaries later. During his time at Princeton, he attempted to curtail the influence of social elites by abolishing the upper-class eating clubs. He proposed moving the students into colleges, also known as quadrangles. Wilson's quad plan was met with fierce opposition from Princeton's alumni. Wilson persisted, saying that giving in would be to temporize with evil. In October 1907, due to the intensity of alumni opposition, the Board of Trustees withdrew its support for the quad plan and instructed Wilson to withdraw it. Not long afterward, Wilson suffered a recurrence of his 1906 ailment. As before, a vacation was prescribed and proved beneficial. Late in his tenure, Wilson had a confrontation with Andrew Fleming West, dean of the graduate school, and also West's ally ex-president Grover Cleveland, who was a trustee. Wilson wanted to integrate a proposed graduate school building into the campus core, while West preferred a more distant campus site. In 1909 Wilson's final year at Princeton began with a gift made to the graduate school campaign subject to the graduate school being located off campus. The acceptance of this condition by the board was a pivotal defeat for Wilson. The national press covered the confrontation as a battle between the elites, represented by West, versus the populists, represented by Wilson. From its outset, Wilson became disenchanted with resistance to his recommendations at Princeton. He ruminated on future political leadership. Prior to the Democratic presidential nominating convention in 1908, Wilson had dropped hints to some influential players in the Democratic Party of his interest in the Democratic ticket. While he had no real expectations of being placed on the ticket, he did leave instructions that he should not be offered the vice presidential nomination. He then left for a vacation in Scotland. Party regulars considered his ideas politically as well as geographically detached and fanciful, but the seeds had been sown. Wilson later commented that politics was less brusque than university administration. Wilson was elected president of the American Political Science Association in 1910, but soon decided to leave his Princeton post and enter New Jersey state politics. McGeorge Bundy in 1956 described Wilson's contribution to Princeton. Wilson was right in his conviction that Princeton must be more than a wonderfully pleasant and decent home for nice young men. It has been more ever since his time. Governor of New Jersey. In January 1910, Wilson had drawn the attention of New Jersey's former U.S. Senator James Smith, Jr., and George Harvey as the potential Democratic standard-bearer in the upcoming gubernatorial election. On July 12, 1910, he was introduced to New Jersey's power players at the Lawyers Club in New York, including James Richard Nugent, Robert S. Hudspeth, Millard F. Ross, and Richard V. Lyndabury. The bosses had chosen their man, but his nomination was not a given. Many, including organized labor, felt Wilson was an inexperienced newcomer. Nevertheless, the bosses marshaled their forces at the party convention, and on September 14 Wilson was nominated, despite his endorsement of the local option on the liquor issue in opposition to his political machine. He submitted his letter of resignation to Princeton on October 20. Wilson's opponent in the general election was the Republican candidate Vivian M. Lewis, the state commissioner of banking and insurance. Wilson's campaign focused on his promise to be independent of party bosses. Wilson quickly shed his professorial style for more emboldened speechmaking, and presented himself as a full-fledged progressive. He soundly defeated Lewis by a margin of more than 650,000 votes. Although Republican William Howard Taft had carried New Jersey in the 1908 presidential election by more than 82,000 votes. Historian Edmund Morris called Wilson in the governor's race a dark horse. He attributed his and others' success against the Taft Republicans in 1910 in part to the emergent national progressive message enunciated by Theodore Roosevelt after his presidency. In the 1910 election, the Democrats also took control of the General Assembly, though the state Senate remained in Republican hands. Wilson appointed Joseph Patrick Tumulty as his private secretary, a position he held throughout Wilson's political career. He began formulating his reformist agenda, intending to ignore the demands of his party machinery. After Wilson's election, political boss and former U.S. Senator Smith asked Wilson to endorse his own re-election bid in the state legislature. This was before popular election of senators. Wilson refused, and endorsed Smith's opponent James Edgar Martine, who had won the primary. When Martine won the seat, Wilson had positioned himself as a new force in the party in that state. Wilson concentrated on four major state reforms: changes in the election laws, a Corrupt Practices Act, workmen's compensation, and establishment of a commission to regulate utilities. The Guerin Bill, drafted by Del Elmer H. Guerin, expanded public participation in primaries for all offices including party officials and delegates. It was thus directed at the power of the political bosses. It passed the state assembly, albeit by a narrow margin. The Corrupt Practices Law and Workmen's Compensation Statute soon followed. A number of other reforms were realized during the remainder of Wilson's term as governor. Free dental clinics were established, a comprehensive and scientific poor law was enacted, and the usage of common drinking cups was prohibited. Trained nursing was also standardized, while contract labor in all reformatories and prisons was abolished. An Indeterminate Sentence Act was passed, and regulation of weights and measures was carried out. A law was introduced that compelled all railroad companies to pay their employees twice monthly, while regulation of the working hours, health, safety, employment, and age of people employed in mercantile establishments was carried out. Contract labor in penal institutions was abolished. In addition, a law was passed extending the civil service to employees of the state, counties, and municipalities. Labor by women and children was limited, and oversight of factory working conditions was strengthened. A new state board of education was also set up with the power to conduct inspections and enforce standards, regulate districts' borrowing authority, and require special classes for students with handicaps. Presidential election of 1912. Democratic nomination. Wilson's prominence as governor and in the equipped merchant marine. This lasted until March 1915, when he moderated, drew back from the bill and, without its passage, congratulated the Congress for its work in the session just ended. His initial journey through mourning was evident. In February 1915 Wilson had met Edith Balling Galt, a Southern widow and jeweler. After several meetings, he fell in love, and in May, Wilson proposed. He was rebuffed initially, but Wilson was undeterred and the courtship continued. Edith initially did not pursue the furtherance of their physical interaction with the vigor of Wilson, but she gradually warmed to the relationship and they became secretly engaged in the fall of 1915. Many in Wilson's camp had become concerned about the appearance of a premature romance soon after the death of his wife. The engagement was made public in October and they were married on December 18, 1915. Wilson was the third president to marry while in office, after John Tyler in 1844 and Grover Cleveland in 1886. Events leading to U.S. entry into World War I, 1914–16. From 1914 until early 1917, Wilson's primary objective was to keep America out of the war in Europe, and his policy was, the true spirit of neutrality, which is the spirit of impartiality and fairness and friendliness to all concerned. The President insisted that all government actions be neutral, and that the belligerents must respect that neutrality according to the norms of international law. Wilson told the Senate in August 1914 when the war began that the United States must be impartial in thought as well as in action, must put a curb upon our sentiments as well as upon every transaction that might be construed as a preference of one party to the struggle before another. He was ambiguous whether he meant the United States as a nation or meant all Americans as individuals. Wilson has been accused of violating his own rule of neutrality. Later that month he explained himself privately to his top foreign policy advisor Colonel House, who recalled the episode later. I was interested to hear him express as his opinion what I had written him some time ago in one of my letters, to the effect that if Germany won it would change the course of our civilization and make the United States a military nation. He also spoke of his deep regret, as indeed I did to him in that same letter, that it would check his policy for a better international ethical code. He felt deeply the destruction of Louvat, and I found him as unsympathetic with the German attitude as is the balance of America. He goes even further than I in his condemnation of Germany's part in this war, and almost allows his feeling to include the German people as a whole rather than the leaders alone. He said German philosophy was essentially selfish and lacking in spirituality. When I spoke of the Kaiser building up the German machine as a means of maintaining peace, he said, what a foolish thing it was to create a powder magazine and risk someone's dropping a spark into it. He thought the war would throw the world back 3 or 4 centuries. I did not agree with him. He was particularly scornful of Germany's disregard of treaty obligations, and was indignant at the German Chancellor's designation of the Belgian Treaty as being only a scrap of paper, but although the personal feeling of the President was with the Allies, he insisted then and for many months after, that this ought not to affect his political attitude, which he intended should be one of strict neutrality. He felt that he owed it to the world to prevent the spreading of the conflagration, that he owed it to the country to save it from the horrors of war. He made numerous offers to mediate and sent Colonel House on diplomatic missions. Both sides politely dismissed these overtures. When Britain declared a blockade of neutral ships carrying contraband goods to Germany, Wilson mildly protested non-lethal British violations of neutral rights. The British knew that it would not be a casus belli for the United States. In early 1915 Germany declared the waters around Great Britain to be a war zone. Wilson dispatched a note of protest, imposing strict accountability on Germany for the safety of neutral ships. The meaning of the policy, dubiously applied to specific incidents, evolved with the policy of neutrality, but ultimately formed the substance of U.S. responses over the next 2 years. The main crisis came when a German U-boat sank the British ocean liner RMS Lusitania in May 1915. International law required a warning so that passengers and crew could board lifeboats. No warning was issued and the ship sank in 18 minutes, with 1,000 deaths including over 100 Americans. Wilson said, "There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. There is such a thing as a nation being so right that it does not need to convince others by force that it is right." Many reacted to these remarks with contempt. Wilson protested to Berlin but its reply was evasive. Secretary of State Bryan, strongly opposed to war, resigned and was replaced by Robert Lansing. The White Star liner the SS Arabique was then torpedoed, with 2 American casualties. Wilson threatened a diplomatic break unless Germany repudiated the action. Germany then gave a written promise: liners will not be sunk by our submarines. Wilson had won a promise that merchant ships would not be sunk without warning, and most importantly he had kept the U.S. out of the war. Meanwhile, Wilson requested and received funds in the final 1916 appropriations bill to provide for 500,000 troops. It also included a 5-year Navy plan for major construction of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, showing Wilson's dedication to a big navy. In March 1916 the SS Sussex, an unarmed ferry under the French flag, was torpedoed in the English Channel and 4 Americans were counted among the dead. The Germans had flouted the post-Lusitania exchanges. The President demanded the Germans reject their submarine tactics. Wilson drew praise when he succeeded in wringing from Germany a pledge to constrain their U-boat warfare to the rules of cruiser warfare. This was a clear departure from existing practices, a diplomatic concession from which Germany could only more brazenly withdraw, and regrettably did. Wilson made a plea for post-war world peace in May 1916. His speech recited the right of every nation to its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and freedom from aggression. "So sincerely do we believe these things," Wilson said, "that I am sure that I speak the mind and wish of the people of America when I say that the United States is willing to become a partner in any feasible association of nations formed in order to realize these objectives." At home the speech was seen as a turning point in policy. In Europe the words were received by the British and the French without comment. His harshest European critics rightly thought the speech reflected indifference on Wilson's part. Indeed, Wilson never wavered from a belief that the war was the result of corrupt European power politics. Wilson made his final offer to mediate peace on December 18, 1916. As a preliminary, he asked both sides to state their minimum terms necessary for future security. The Central Powers replied that victory was certain, and the Allies required the dismemberment of their enemies' empires. No desire for peace existed, and the offer lapsed. Presidential election of 1916. Wilson's remarriage rejuvenated his personal aspirations for re-election. Edith Wilson enjoyed, as Ellen never had, the crowds and the power as a close collaborator with her husband. Executive decisions just prior to the campaign also enabled Wilson to bolster his political mastery. He was presented with a vacancy on the Supreme Court, which he succeeded in filling with a controversial nominee, Louis Brandeis, the first Jewish member of the court. Also, in the summer of 1916 the nation's economy was endangered by a railroad strike. The president called the parties to a White House summit in August. After 2 days and no results, Wilson proceeded to settle the issue, using the maximum 8-hour workday as the linchpin. Once the Congress passed the Adamson Bill incorporating the president's proposal, the strike was cancelled. Wilson was praised for averting a national economic disaster, though the law was received with howls from conservatives denouncing a sellout to the unions and a surrender by Congress to an imperious president. In the campaign, McCombs was replaced as chairman of the Democratic Party by Vance C. McCormick, a leading progressive, and Ambassador Henry Morgenthau was recalled from Turkey to manage campaign finances. Colonel House played an important role in the campaign. He planned its structure, set its tone, helped guide its finance, chose speakers, tactics, and strategy, and, not least, handled the campaign's greatest asset and greatest potential liability, its brilliant but temperamental candidate. Wilson, renominated without opposition, employed his campaign slogan "He kept us out of war," though he never promised unequivocally to stay out of the war. In his acceptance speech on September 2, 1916, Wilson pointedly warned Germany that submarine warfare resulting in American deaths would not be tolerated, saying the nation that violates these essential rights must expect to be checked and called to account by direct challenge and resistance. It at once makes the quarrel in part our own. As the party platform was drafted, Senator Owen of Oklahoma urged Wilson to take ideas from the Progressive Party platform of 1912 as a means of attaching to our party progressive Republicans who are in sympathy with us in so large a degree. At Wilson's request, Owen highlighted federal legislation to promote workers' health and safety, prohibit child labor, provide unemployment compensation and establish minimum wages and maximum hours. Wilson, in turn, included in his draft platform a plank that called for all work performed by and for the federal government to provide a minimum wage, an 8-hour day and 6-day workweek, health and safety measures, the prohibition of child labor, and, his own additions, safeguards for female workers and a retirement program. Wilson's opponent was Republican Charles Evans Hughes, former governor of New York with a progressive record similar to Wilson's as governor of New Jersey. Theodore Roosevelt commented that the only thing different between Hughes and Wilson was a shave. However, Hughes had to try to hold together a coalition of conservative Taft supporters and progressive Roosevelt partisans, and his campaign never assumed a definite form. Wilson ran on his record and ignored Hughes, reserving his attacks for Roosevelt. When asked why he did not attack Hughes directly, Wilson told a friend, "Never murder a man who is committing suicide." The election outcome was in doubt for several days and was determined by several close states. Wilson won California by 3,773 of almost a million votes cast, and New Hampshire by 56 votes. Hughes won Minnesota by 393 votes out of over 358,000. In the final count, Wilson had 277 electoral votes versus Hughes' 254. Wilson was able to win by picking up many votes that had gone to Teddy Roosevelt or Eugene V. Debs in 1912. By the time Hughes' concession telegram arrived, Wilson commented it was a little moth-eaten when it got here. In December 1916, a month after his re-election, Wilson, a noted supporter of mothers' pensions, addressed a conference on social insurance in which he spoke of how a conference like that gave evidence of the dominant interest of our own time, and one of the best elements of social insurance is social understanding and interchange of views and a comprehension of interests which for a long time was only too rare. Second term, 1917–1921. Entry into World War I. Wilson objected to Britain's seizure of mail from neutral ships and its blacklisting of firms that did any business with Germany. Wilson insisted a League of Nations was the solution to ending the war. Wilson found it increasingly difficult to maintain neutrality, after Germany rescinded earlier promises, the Arabic Pledge and the Sussex Pledge. Early in 1917, the German ambassador Johann von Bernstorff informed the U.S. of Germany's commitment to unrestricted submarine warfare. Then came the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany attempted to enlist Mexico as a fighting ally. Wilson's reaction after consulting the cabinet and the Congress was a minimal one: that diplomatic relations with the Germans be brought to a halt. The President said, "We are the sincere friends of the German people and earnestly desire to remain at peace with them. We shall not believe they are hostile to us unless or until we are obliged to believe it." In March 1917, several American ships were sunk by Germany. The cabinet was unanimously in favor of war. Wilson delivered his war message to a special session of Congress on April 2, 1917, declaring that Germany's latest pronouncement had rendered his armed neutrality policy untenable and asking Congress to declare Germany's war stance was an act of war. He proposed the United States enter the war to vindicate principles of peace and justice in the life of the world as against selfish and autocratic power. The German government, Wilson said, means to stir up enemies against us at our very doors. He then also warned that if there should be disloyalty, it will be dealt with a firm hand of repression. Wilson closed with, "Our object is to vindicate the principles of peace and justice in the life of the world as against selfish and autocratic power. We are glad to fight for the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its peoples, the German peoples included, for the right of nations great and small and the privilege of men everywhere to choose their way of life and of obedience. The world must be made safe for democracy. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make." The declaration of war by the United States against Germany passed Congress by strong bipartisan majorities on April 4, 1917, with opposition from ethnic German strongholds and remote rural areas in the South. Wilson refused to make a formal alliance with Britain or France but operated as an associated power and informal ally with military cooperation through the Supreme War Council in London. The U.S. raised a massive army through conscription and Wilson gave command to Pershing, with complete authority as to tactics, strategy, and some diplomacy. Colonel House was Wilson's main channel of communication with the British government. March 1917 also brought the first of two revolutions in Russia, which impacted the strategic role of the U.S. in the war. The overthrow of the imperial government removed a serious barrier to America's entry into the European conflict, while the Second Revolution in November relieved the Germans of a major threat on their eastern front, and allowed them to dedicate more troops to the Western Front, thus making U.S. forces central to Allied success in battles of 1918. Wilson initially rebuffed pleas from the Allies to dedicate military resources to an intervention in Russia against the Bolsheviks, based partially on his experience from attempted intervention in Mexico. Nevertheless, he ultimately was convinced of the potential benefit and agreed to dispatch a limited force to assist the Allies on the Eastern Front. The Germans launched an offensive at Arras which prompted an accelerated deployment of troops by Wilson to the Western Front. By August 1918, 1 million American troops had reached France. The Allies initiated a counter-offensive at Somme, and by August the Germans had lost the military initiative and an Allied victory was in sight. In October came a message from the new German Chancellor Prince Max of Baden to Wilson requesting a general armistice. In the exchange of notes with Germany, they agreed the 14 points in principle be incorporated in the armistice. House then procured agreement from France and Britain, but only after threatening to conclude a unilateral armistice without them. Wilson ignored General Pershing's plea to drop the armistice and instead demand an unconditional surrender by Germany. Home front. The War Industries Board, headed by Bernard Baruch, was established to set U.S. war manufacturing policies and goals. Future President Herbert Hoover led the Food Administration. To conserve food, the Federal Fuel Administration, run by Henry Garfield, introduced daylight saving time and rationed fuel supplies. William Mikado was in charge of war bond efforts and Vance McCormick headed the War Trade Board. All of the above, known collectively as the War Cabinet, met weekly with Wilson at the White House. These and other bodies were headed by businessmen recruited by Wilson for $1 a day salary to make the government more efficient in the war effort. More favorable treatment was extended to those unions that supported the U.S. war effort, such as the American Federation of Labor, AFL. Wilson worked closely with Samuel Gompers and the AFL, the Railroad Brotherhoods, and other moderate unions, which saw enormous growth in membership and wages during Wilson's administration. In the absence of rationing, consumer prices soared, income taxes also increased and workers suffered. Despite this, appeals to buy war bonds were highly successful. The purchase of wartime bonds had the result of shifting the cost of the war to the taxpayers of the affluent 1920s. Anti-war groups, anarchists, communists, industrial workers of the world members, and other anti-war groups attempting to sabotage the war effort were targeted by the Department of Justice. Many of their leaders were arrested for incitement to violence, espionage, or sedition. Wilson also established the first Western Propaganda Office, the United States Committee on Public Information, headed by George Creel, the Creel Commission, which circulated patriotic anti-German appeals and conducted censorship of materials considered seditious. To further counter disloyalty to the war effort at home, Wilson pushed through Congress the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 to suppress anti-British, pro-German, or anti-war statements. While he welcomed socialists who supported the war, he pushed at the same time to arrest and deport foreign-born enemies. Many recent immigrants, resident aliens without U.S. citizenship, who opposed America's participation in the war were deported to Soviet Russia or other nations under the powers granted in the Immigration Act of 1918. In an effort at reform and to shake up his mobilization program, Wilson removed the Chief of the Army Signal Corps and the Chairman of the Aircraft Production Board on April 18, 1918. On May 16, the President launched an investigation, headed by Republican Charles Evans Hughes, into the War Department and the Council of Defense. The Hughes report released on October 31 found no major corruption violations or theft in Wilson's mobilization program, although the report found incompetence in the aircraft program. With congressional elections approaching, in 1918 Wilson made an appeal to the public for the retention of a Democratic majority, and this seriously backfired due to its selfing tone. Republicans successfully picked up majorities in both houses of Congress. The 14 points. Wilson initiated a secret series of studies named the Inquiry, primarily focused on Europe, and carried out by a group in New York which included geographers, historians, and political scientists. The group was directed by Colonel House. The studies culminated in a speech by Wilson to Congress on January 8, 1918, wherein he articulated America's long-term war objectives. It was the clearest expression of intention made by any of the belligerent nations. The speech, known as the 14 Points, was authored mainly by Walter Lippmann and projected Wilson's progressive domestic policies into the international arena. The first 6 dealt with diplomacy, freedom of the seas and settlement of colonial claims. Then territorial issues were addressed and the final point, the establishment of an association of nations to guarantee the independence and territorial integrity of all nations, a League of Nations. The address was translated into many languages for global dissemination. Peace Conference 1919. When the time came, Wilson spent 6 months in Paris for the Peace Conference, thereby becoming the first U.S. president to travel to Europe while in office. He disembarked from the George Washington in Brest on December 13. While in Italy, January 16, 1919, for meetings with King Victor Emmanuel III and Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando, he became the first incumbent U.S. president to have an audience with a reigning pope, when he visited Pope Benedict XV at the Apostolic Palace. Wilson took a break from the negotiations and departed February 14, 1919 for home, then returned to Paris 3 weeks later and remained until the conclusion of a treaty in June. Heckscher describes Wilson, during the first 4 weeks of the conference as playing, with force and discretion, a commanding role. He established his priorities, secured accommodation on major issues and won preliminary acceptance of the League. He promoted his plan in France, and then at home in February. Wilson gave a speech at the Metropolitan Opera House in defense of the League. He was more insistent about it than ever. Heckscher contends that the enduring image of Wilson as a grim, unsmiling, and unforgiving figure dates from this visit home during the conference. While the general public along with editorial writers, churches, and peace groups generally favored the League, the Republicans vowed to defeat the League and discredit Wilson. Wilson notably did not address the Congress as to ongoing deliberations at the Peace Conference, as indeed his counterpart Lloyd George did with Parliament. Heckscher opines that this was a missed opportunity to forge the debate even though the congressional majority had changed. In France he was without the usual control over his message through the media. In fact, the French initiated an aggressive propaganda campaign in the midst of the conference to affect its outcome. After his visit home, and while en route back to France, Wilson suffered an illness. The ensuing months brought a decline in health and in power and prestige. On arrival, it was immediately clear the conference had struggled in his absence. Colonel House had compromised Wilson's prior gains, and Wilson set out to attempt to regain the lost ground. During these dark days of the conference, Taft cabled to Wilson 3 proposed amendments to the League Covenant which he thought would considerably increase its acceptability to the Europeans: the right of withdrawal from the League, the exemption of domestic issues from the League, and the inviolability of the Monroe Doctrine. Wilson very reluctantly accepted these amendments, explaining why he later was more inflexible in the Senate treaty negotiations. On April 3 Wilson fell violently ill during a conference meeting, in a narrow escape from influenza. Though his symptoms receded within a couple of days, those around him noticed a distinct, lasting deterioration. The charter of the proposed League of Nations was incorporated into the conference's Treaty of Versailles. Japan proposed that the covenant include a racial equality clause. Wilson was indifferent to the issue, but acceded to strong opposition from Australia and Britain. After the conference, Wilson said, "At last the world knows America as the savior of the world." For his peacemaking efforts, Wilson was awarded the 1919 Nobel Peace Prize. Economist John Maynard Keynes asserted Wilson was not well regarded at the conference. He was in many respects ill-informed as to European conditions, his mind was slow and unadaptable. There can seldom have been a statesman of the first rank more incompetent than the president in the agilities of the council chamber. Keynes' highly regarded rhetoric became the prevailing judgment of the conference for decades. Treaty fight, 1919. The chances were less than favorable for ratification of the treaty by a 2/3 vote of the Republican Senate. Public opinion was mixed, with intense opposition from most Republicans, Germans, and Irish Catholic Democrats. In numerous meetings with senators, Wilson discovered opposition had hardened. Despite his weakened physical condition, Wilson decided to barnstorm the western states, scheduling 29 major speeches and many short ones to rally support. Wilson had earlier downplayed Germany's guilt in starting the war by calling for peace without victory, but he had taken an increasingly hard stand at Paris and rejected advice to soften the treaty's treatment of Germany. In a reversal of his earlier position, in summer 1919 Wilson repeatedly stressed Germany's guilt, saying the treaty seeks to punish one of the greatest wrongs ever done in history, the wrong which Germany sought to do to the world and to civilization, and there ought to be no weak purpose with regard to the application of the punishment. She attempted an intolerable thing, and she must be made to pay for the attempt. Wilson had a series of debilitating strokes and had to cut short his trip on September 26, 1919. He became an invalid in the White House, closely monitored by his wife, who insulated him from negative news and downplayed for him the gravity of his condition. Senator Lodge led the opposition to the treaty in the Republican-controlled Senate. The key point of disagreement was whether the League would diminish the power of Congress to declare war. It proved possible to build a majority for the treaty in the Senate, but the two-thirds coalition needed to ratify was insurmountable. One bloc of Democrats strongly supported the Versailles Treaty, a second group supported the treaty but followed Wilson in opposing any amendments or reservations. The largest bloc, Lodge and the Republicans, wanted a treaty with reservations, especially on Article X, which empowered the League of Nations to make war without a vote by the United States Congress. Finally, a bipartisan group of 13 irreconcilables opposed a treaty in any form. In mid-November 1919 Lodge and his Republicans formed a coalition with the pro-treaty Democrats, and were close to a two-thirds majority for a treaty with reservations, but the seriously indisposed Wilson rejected this compromise and enough Democrats followed his lead to defeat ratification. Cooper and Bailey suggest that Wilson's stroke in September had debilitated him from negotiating effectively with Lodge. Post-war, 1919–1920. Wilson's administration did effectively demobilize the country at the war's end. A plan to form a commission for the purpose was abandoned in the face of Republican control of the Senate, which complicated the appointment of commission members. Instead, Wilson favored the prompt dismantling of wartime boards and regulatory agencies. Demobilization was chaotic and violent. 4 million soldiers were sent home with little planning, little money, few benefits, and other vague promises. A wartime bubble in prices of farmland burst, leaving many farmers deeply in debt after they purchased new land. There were social tensions as veterans tried to find jobs, and existing workers struggled to protect theirs, as well as to gain better wages and conditions. Major strikes in the steel, coal, and meat-packing industries disrupted the economy in 1919. These conditions were catalysts for outbreaks of racial animosity that erupted in serious race riots of ethnic whites against blacks in Chicago, Omaha, and 24 other major cities in the North. It was called the Red Summer of 1919. As the election of 1920 approached, Wilson momentarily imagined that a deadlocked Democratic convention might nominate him for a third term with a campaign focused on the League of Nations. No one around the president adequately clarified for him that he was too incapacitated, had insufficient support, and that the League defeat was irreversible. In retirement, Wilson harbored hopes for a White House run in 1924 despite the absence of substantial support. Other foreign affairs. Wilson frequently intervened in Latin American affairs, saying in 1913, "I am going to teach the South American republics to elect good men." These interventions included Mexico in 1914, Haiti in 1915, the Dominican Republic in 1916, Cuba in 1917, and Panama in 1918. The U.S. maintained troops in Nicaragua throughout the Wilson administration and used them to select the president of Nicaragua and then to force Nicaragua to pass the Bryan-Chamorro Treaty. Additionally, American troops in Haiti under the command of the federal government forced the Haitian legislature to elect as president a pro-Western candidate who was favored by Wilson though less popular among the Haitian citizenry. Wilson ordered the military occupation of the Dominican Republic shortly after the resignation of its president Juan Isidro Jiménez Pereira in 1916. The U.S. military worked in concert with wealthy Dominican landowners to suppress the guerrilleros, a campesino guerrilla force fighting the occupation. The occupation lasted until 1924, and was notorious for its brutality against those in the resistance. Wilson also negotiated a treaty with Colombia in which the U.S. apologized for its role in the Panama Revolution of 1903–1904. After Russia left.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.